Welcome to Cybersecurity Refined and Feral, where refinement meets chaos in the digital world. We invite you to join your co-hosts Candy Alexander and Cailin Sullivan in another open conversation on topics related to cybersecurity.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we're tackling a massive point of frustration we've been seeing in the industry. It seems like everyone is slapping the label of AI governance onto things that aren't really governance at all.
Exactly, Kaylin. We're seeing companies point to their AI ops or their machine learning pipelines like data cleaning or compute scaling and saying, look, we have AI governance. But operating the engine efficiently is very different from knowing who goes to jail if the car crashes.
And to help us cut through this, we have the perfect guest. James Kavanagh is a former engineering leader at AWS and Microsoft, and incredibly, he delivered the world's very first ISO 42001 certification, which is the international standard for AI management systems.
We are so excited to have James back as a guest. We've had him on before. He is the definition of a practitioner. When we first reached out to James, he said that it really struck a chord and he agreed very much with our observation that AI governance is now the catch-all. And he has been quoted by saying people doing the work are less confused than the people talking about it. But just like cyber, there are doers and then there's talkers. So we're excited to welcome him in a moment onto our show. We hope you enjoy. Hello, James, and welcome to the show. We are so thrilled to have you here today.
Oh, great. No, it's nice to be back. Thank you, Candy, Cailin. It's lovely to be back and to talk.
Absolutely. Thrilled to have you, as I mentioned. So, this whole thing about AI ops versus AI governance and that whole mess, we see this blanket term AI governance being used to describe everything, as I mentioned, from MLOps to basic software patching. Why is the industry so eager to mistake operational tools for actual governance? And what is the danger in that? Or is there no danger?
Well, I think we're all trying to figure out our way through this to some extent. Like we're all learning, we're all trying to understand what's the right way to govern this new technology and how does it fit with existing practices? What are the right tools, the right methodologies and approaches? So I'm not too concerned about like some ambiguity in what's the right way to think about governance. I do think that there are a lot of different disciplines that have to come into achieving governance objectives. And sometimes it's more useful to talk about what is the governance objective and what are the different disciplines that need to contribute to that than necessarily trying to label, well, this is AIOps and this is AI security and this is AI eval and so on. They all play a role. I find it more useful to try and think in terms of what's the governance objective and then what are the disciplines that contribute to that objective. And so like to start it off, I mean, I would say governance objective. One thing we should be really clear on is practically the governance objective is safe, secure, lawful use of AI. And to me, those are quite objective things. You can measure them, you can assign work around them, you can make sure you design, you operate, you procure safely, you make sure that you can secure and operate your systems, you make sure that you're complying with the law. Those kinds of things is what I think is, you start with the objectives first. And then we think about like tools and disciplines and professions and so on, and certifications, all that kind of stuff. But where we get a little lost sometimes is objectives. And some people, I think, bring in some odd objectives. And, I don't want to be dismissive of some of these things too much, but I'm not so sure that some of the ethical objections or existential risks of AI are actually the right things to bring into what I would say is corporate governance or AI governance, because you have to have the tools or the mechanisms to be able to address those things. And existential risk of AI is not something for most organizations to think about. And yet I see that some professionals are trying to work on that and try and think about that and spend time on it. I don't think it's that important compared to, for an enterprise, safe, secure, lawful operation. What do you think?
So, what does focusing on those actual outputs actually look like in a enterprise?
Well, I'll give you an example. If you look at some organizations and you ask what is their approach to responsible AI or safe, secure AI, what they can quite easily give you is a set of principles. Like they'll say, we use AI safely and we make sure it's fair for our consumers and so on. And that's fine. Everybody has those like nice vanilla statements. But the question is like going one level deeper, what do you commit to? So how do you turn those principles into commitments? And then even more interesting, if you say we will commit or we will do this, then the next question is, how do you specify that? How am I going to measure it? How am I going to hold you to account for it? And so I look at it and go, okay, if safety is an objective, then the principle is we will not use AI that is harmful, or we'll mitigate harm as best we can. And then the measure around that might be saying we will evaluate every AI system for these specific sets of harms before we, let's say, apply them in clinical use or we implement them in a school or an education environment. So where I kind of start with is if the objective is safe, secure, and lawful, then let's get clear principles around applying AI to those objectives, then turn them into commitments, and then let's see some specifications. Let's see some actual measures that could quantify that. I think we've done that in cyber. Like I've seen that over the years, and I think you've probably seen that progression in cyber. We haven't seen that progression in AI
Hmm.
governance, AI safety so much yet.
But I agree with you. But when we talk about defining those objectives and the principles, um, it seems, my observation, that everybody is clamoring to be the champion or the owner of that within the organization. We hear the privacy people jumping up and down saying, we need to make sure it's, safe, secure, and lawful. And then, well, they want it safe and lawful. But the security officer says, I want it secure, but it also needs to be, safe and lawful. And so then we hear perhaps the CTO say none of those things, but I need to get it out the door. And then you have senior leadership says, we just want it to happen. So, like, how do you go from everybody claiming to be the owner of facilitating, leading the AI governance, or shall we just break it down and say governance, to everybody having it to nobody really doing it? And how do you make that change?
So with difficulty, it's the real challenge here. I think the reality is it comes down to trying to be clear on the different disciplines that are involved in achieving those objectives and how ownership gets assigned to those different disciplines to work together. So, I look at it, and when I'm teaching, I focus on these set of different disciplines that need to build up. And
Hmm.
so you have a discipline around risk, you have a discipline around compliance, you have a discipline around audit, and those three are not all the same. They take different perspectives on the problem, and they have different functions. Like a risk assessor is thinking of the future potential. The auditor is looking back and looking at, was the control effective? And so they've got different mindsets, different purposes, and that's just three of them. And then you have engineering, which I think is not as well represented as it should be in governance conversations. But engineering, they need to think about, how do I design safe, secure control mechanisms? And that's more challenging than it might be thought. And you've got operations people, and you work with engineering and operations people. They're not the same people. They have different kind of mindsets. uh, of design versus operations. So it makes sense to have differences. And then you have people who do evaluations. So there's no point in having all the risk and compliance and audit functionality if you don't have somebody who can evaluate a model's fairness or a model's drift and things like that. So you've got an evaluation discipline. And the engineers and operations people, they don't think like evaluators. They're scientists versus builders. And then you have security people who are starting more and more to come into that. And as you know, like there's a security mindset of adversarial thinking that I don't think it exists in many disciplines at all other than security. To think like an attacker is a security mindset that takes years to develop and do really well. And then there's leadership. And leadership has to create the culture and the environment and the resources and the program and measure and monitor that and so on. So like that's 8 different disciplines that I could easily say all of them contribute to AI governance outcomes or more, even more broadly to governance outcomes. And I couldn't say that any of them are directly interchangeable, that you could just like condense them all into one role or anything like that. They all have quite different mindsets. So I kind of think it's okay to have those different disciplines. What's important is that they're all working towards common objectives, and there's kind of the glue that ties them together.
So who do you see as the facilitator of that whole
so
cog-
so
cogs and the wheels and all that? I
yeah.
mean,
In many organizations, I do see that as like an emerging role of an AI governance leader.
okay.
But like many kind of changes that have happened in IT and corporate, sometimes these roles only exist for a period of time. They kind of mobilize momentum and they get people moving, they fill in the gaps when people are only learning their skills, and they create the mechanisms for people to all work together. But over time, that role gets distributed much more, and it's less need for there to be the kind of the facilitator, and there's more just need for there to be leadership and for
hmm
there to be the disciplines that work together. You know, it's a little bit like I think back to digital transformation. Like 10 years ago, people were saying, "Oh, you need to have a digital transformation lead," and everybody was creating transformation officers and things like that. Like, but that doesn't make sense anymore because it's diffused into organizations. I think
Yes.
AI governance kind of similar. I do think there's a bit of a worry that um, AI governance is seen as somehow distinct from technology governance or corporate governance, that it somehow can exist as a little perfect palace on top of a mess of other corporate and technology governance, and it just doesn't work. Um, so somehow I think that governance needs to be much more integrated as well.
I'm glad you said that because I see this happening where, you have that AI governance leader and they're leading the charge and, bravo, good for you. But let's not forget all the other governance efforts and initiatives. And so it almost seems way too logical, but it should fall under the big governance, with a capital G in front of it, that handles all of the organizations, whether it's data governance, whether it's risk governance, whether it's cyber and now AI. So, like if I was to establish the perfect organization, I would have like a governance lead, could be the CRO, the chief risk officer. I don't know. There's somebody up there on the top and then like all these different governance disciplines being champions for that stovepipe, if you will. I don't
See,
know.
I wouldn't. I'd be the opposite.
Let's
So
hear
if
it.
I was from a like a perfect world perspective, I kind of think that governance needs to be embedded in where the work is being done. And most of the situations where I've seen governance not being very effective is where it's somehow separated in a silo. Like there's a governance team, and then there's the team that actually do the work. And it's kind of human nature for them to build silos and be in conflict. Whereas I'm much more of a fan of embedding governance people into, let's say, the engineering teams, and then teaching engineers just enough governance to be able to do their job with an understanding of risk and an awareness of compliance. Not specialists, just generalists, but enough to understand it. I worry when I go into an organization and somebody says to me, like, this is our AI governance organization. And I go, okay, and how is that embedded into how products are built? And what does an engineer or an operations person or a security person do in that environment? And sometimes it's great. Like sometimes I've got great integration. All too often, though, it's like two silos.
So would you classify governance, whether it be AI, pick one, right? I guess let's stick with AI since that is our topic. Would you say that is a tactical or a strategic function within the organization, or is it both? And if so, how would you describe it?
Primarily, it's about achieving strategic objectives. So at different levels, like you can look at it in different ways. But I would say, number one, the purpose of governance in an organization is to ensure that the organization can achieve its strategic objectives and has the oversight mechanisms in place to do that. Like that's kind of governance. And traditionally, we see that as a separation in terms of a board or some form of executive leadership that's performing governance, risk, compliance, and tying those together. So I got no problem with that as like a strategic direction around achieving objectives. Where I think it's quite challenging is how do you govern at a much more detailed level, and how do you bring that through an organization? Because even at the lowest level, like even at the level of an individual system, an individual system is changing all the time. There's new regulations coming in all the time that might affect it. There's new risks emerging, and so on. And so you still have to govern that individual system. You're still governing a team. You're still governing a person. And so the challenge to me is like, how do you build that connectivity all the way from the strategic perspective, which is right to have that strategic objective, all the way down to an individual performing a role where they have to govern the work that they're doing. And I'm a big believer in the concepts of mechanisms and adaptive governance, which is all around saying we build mechanisms to govern. Those mechanisms are owned by somebody, and they're connected to other mechanisms going through the organization. So even a single system will have a mechanism that governs it, but there will be bigger mechanisms that focus on enterprise risk management or compliance management or regulatory engagement and so on. And this is like the practice in Amazon we did was you build governance by building this organization of mechanisms that connect together. And the inputs of one mechanism come from the outputs of another, and it's connected together like an ecosystem. And to me, that's really important because it allows you to connect those big strategic objectives and those strategic governance down to the lowest possible level of an individual working on one system, still needing to know how to govern that. Yes.
So that's really it's really I don't know, fuzzy in my mind, and perhaps for some of our listeners. So is there like a use case, an example that you could share with our audience as to what exactly does that mean? And let's take one of the principal statements like we will use AI to ensure there's no harm. So let's take the harm use case. And so how so the that statement is the strategic objective and goal. So how
Yeah.
does that flow down?
Well, so let's kind of work this out. I'll be even narrower in that harm picture so that we get kind of quite specific. Let's incident management for an
Okay.
AI harm incident, and just how would that be done? So at the most strategic level, you would say, okay, we have a principle of do no harm.
Hmm.
Okay, that might be the principle. But when you go into a little more detail, the reason why that's important is because, well, number one, there are regulatory expectations. There are also reputational risks and requirements around that. And then there's just the vision and the values of the company that might say, "Oh, we don't want to do harm. That's important to us that we don't." So you've got these external expectations, external requirements, and we flow those down into a set of controls. So in a normal organization, that would become a control, and the control would say, we have to have an incident management process. If we do have an incident, we notify our regulator. When we have an incident, we um, review what caused it. We look for lessons learned. We feed that back, and we continuously improve in that way. Right. So you've got all those kinds of expectations first. The way I look at that is I go, okay, well, that's the expectation. That's the control that we have to have. Let's build that in a mechanism. And the mechanism is what actually implements the control. And so a mechanism, the way I describe it is a mechanism is a closed loop, self-improving system. It receives inputs, it does some work on those, and it creates outputs. And so the inputs might be events that come in, like incident reports, like logs or threshold breaches or customer complaint, or it could be a safety issue that's being complained by a customer. That's an input. Then you have a set of tools, and tools might be components, like they might actually be software, but very often they're teams and structures and meetings and so on. And they produce an output. And the output is the incidents being resolved. We've got the lessons learned. We've made the notification to the regulator and so on. So, okay, so we've gone from controls into a mechanism that has inputs, a tool, and an output. And what makes this adaptive and makes it possible to work in something like AI where everything is changing is that there's a couple of other elements that are important. One is that you create an inspection mechanism around that. So inspection just means collect the metrics. So what are the inputs, the quality, the coverage of those metrics? What are the outputs? Um, the time spent, the coverage that happened, the efficiency of that process, and so on, and use those metrics to continuously improve the process. And so there's a feedback loop that continuously improves governance because you're constantly measuring and you're feeding that back into the mechanism. And so when I think about AI governance or any governance, and like this is what I learned in Amazon, this is what we do in Amazon. This is Amazon's kind of magic ingredient of building these kinds of mechanisms, is you look at the expectations, you map them to controls, you implement those controls and mechanisms, and you create this feedback loop that's constantly improving the mechanism, constantly feeding it back. And so it evolves over time. And as a new strategic objectives comes in, or a new requirement, or a change that happens, or a new threat, or a new risk, that feeds into the mechanism and causes the mechanism to change again. So that's a couple of the principles of like how I approach at least adaptive governance. And it's really around trying to connect all those lines together so that, as things change, you're always feeding through into the way that work is done. And one of the things we do in Amazon, and I practice when I'm working with clients, is you identify the very specific owner of that mechanism. That owner should have the right skills, the discipline to do it. So incident management, as we've been talking about here, harm, that's absolutely an ops kind of discipline. And so you assign it to them. Now, regulatory notification is probably not an ops thing, right? They're not great at that. So there would be a handover to legal or to some other discipline to be able to handle that process. And so I look at it and the different disciplines, how they fit together in terms of achieving those objectives. In a really simple way, it's like, what are the expectations? What are the mechanisms? And who are the owners of those mechanisms? And do those owners have the right skills and to be able to do their job?
Uh, I appreciate that very much, and I would agree that that's the real world application. That's how businesses operate. That's the way I've always operated as a CISO. So yeah, it makes sense. I think one thing that gets us all hung up and tied up when we start talking governance is it's scary. Even though, oops, by the way, you're already doing it. And so I think I think one thing that's important is to have people recognize that you are already doing it. And it's important to understand what the process flow is. And oh, by the way, that's a governance stream and or process. Are we getting too hung up now on that fact that we already do these things operationally and strategically and all of that? It's not by osmosis, it's by design, but we don't call it governance. And now all of a sudden, with AI coming into our reality, everybody's jumping up and down. And so now I'm coming full circle to the beginning of our conversation. Notice how we did that? So now AI is coming back in and saying, and everybody's screaming AI governance, AI governance. So is everybody saying we need to have a operational process flow for efficiency to meet those strategic objectives and principles? And oh, by the way, that's governance? Or am I missing it?
I think what maybe is important to reflect is that not everybody is talking that way. So I would say that many of the people who are the most capable practitioners that I work with, in some organizations that very good at using AI, they would describe their work as ensuring the safety and security of their systems, but they would not describe their work as governance. Um, and everybody's coming from this from different perspectives. And I would say there's an interesting, for example, divide between safety, AI safety and AI governance. Many of the people who work in AI safety science and evaluations and the implementation of safety in, guiding engineering teams to do it, do not call themselves governance people. Um, they still perform a really important governance function and they contribute to achieving those objectives, but they don't see themselves as governance. Um, I think where a lot of governance talk and conversation is really looking at it from the audit, compliance, legal perspective. And to some extent, I think part of it is there's a lack of practical experience doing the work. And so people talk about it a lot, but we have far fewer people doing the work than talking about it. And that's one of the things that, like, a lot of what we do is try and help people get from having the knowledge to applying it in practice. And I think the most important step is that step when you go from I've learned and I've got my AIGP and I've got my, ISACA certs and so on, to okay, have you actually built it in practice? And when you find people doing it in practice, then a lot of I think the terminology disappears and the work wins.
Okay.
And so I wouldn't be kind of going, everybody's talking about AI governance. I think most people doing real governance, real practical practitioner work would probably not say that they're doing AI governance.
I am laughing because you have just said the words that make me feel so much better. Seriously, I mean, yeah, because that's the world we're in right now, right? It's like, I hate to say this, those that are doing the talking are actually the ones that are just talking. They're not the doers. And this is what the premise of your foundational beliefs are, correct? That
Yeah. Yeah. it's real when you do, and you learn best by doing. And I don't want to dismiss, like, it's so important to build that knowledge. And so I help teach people how to get the AIGP and other certifications and so on. But I'm always really clear, like that's your starting point. That gets you to the start line. The real important step is the next one as you start to apply it. And then the next one beyond that is the really interesting one for governance. So I talk in terms of like these 3 leaps that people take in their career. And the first leap is when you've accumulated a bit of knowledge, but then you have to actually practice it. And it's a scary leap because like you realize just how much you don't know when you take that
Yes.
leap. It's scary. Um, and then once you've done that, though, then you start really developing some strength of really good knowledge. You get the tools, you get the application skills, and then pretty. Some people it's really quick. Some people it takes years. You get to the next leap, which to me is when you realize that many problems can't be solved with a technical fix. And you realize that the human dimension, even of something like cybersecurity or something like really technical like AI engineering, um, the real next leap is the adaptive challenge of how do I influence and how do I communicate and how do I make
Yes.
really good judgment calls and so on. Um, and so I think that's the fascinating leap. And then there's one more leap, which is you've been doing that and you're really capable. You're really good at influence. You're really good at making good decisions. And then you realize that you have to build a team rather than build your own capability. And then you become a leader, and that's like a leadership leap. So I try to help people make those leaps. And there's so many people at that start line. It's wonderful. Like it's so good that so many people are coming into the field. We need more. But then we have to help them move to the next steps to really be effective.
So, what you just described is a career life cycle. Like cyber, if I take that model that you just articulated, and I completely agree and see exactly the path in which you speak because it equates in cyber. People say to me, Candy, how do I get started in cyber? I say, go and get your Security Plus, your CompTIA Security Plus, get a certification, get book smart. And then you got to go out and then you have to do your hands on and get your fingers, into the pie and get your hands dirty, get your experience. And then it comes to persuasion of others, being able to communicate, which as technologists, we're very challenged with, right? Effective communications and all of that. And then, building the team and realizing you're no longer a doer. You're a teacher, you're an instructor, you're a Sherpa, you're a guide. So I think I, I really did not think about that AI career path, right? As such, because I'm so busy thinking about it just being embraced and incorporated into existing organizations, that I didn't really think about that. So I really appreciate you shining that light on that whole new path because I do think that that is a whole new path and sector coming through.
Yeah, it is definitely it's a whole new profession in a field. And so I would say that the exciting thing is that it's changing so much and evolving. But even as it does evolve, when you let me try and examine like an example from cybersecurity. If you think about cyber maybe 15 years ago when we were all racing around getting our certs and um, and started to get the likes of CISSP and going through SANS training and so on. Um, look back at it now, there's, I don't know, maybe 100 different professional certifications in cybersecurity, maybe
Yeah.
more, probably more.
Yes, I used to say when I was with ISSA International, we did a study, and I think um, maybe year 4 or 5, we did a survey, and there was like 176 vacations. Yeah. So,
and and, and I love looking at them and going, okay, so which ones taught just knowledge, just just the book, which ones tried to immerse you into the practice, which ones actually really did try to teach you influence and judgment and those kind of challenging skills. Um, and did any of them really teach you to lead and to create safety cultures and security cultures and so on? There are definitely like some in all of those categories, but the bulk of them are in that first kind of knowledge slice because it's kind of the easier one to deliver in, and it's kind of the easier one to create courses and so on. Um, I believe, and I'm betting my business on the idea that um, I think people need different things
Hmm.
along that career journey, and
Yeah.
the knowledge is great, but let's look at the next step and the next step and the next step. And so what we're trying to do is create master practitioners. That's that's my goal, is to help people get all the way through from knowledge into practice into adaptive into leadership and be master practitioners, and then to spread that to everybody else and build that into every discipline that's out there. Um, and it's so fun. It's there's so many people trying to going through that journey. It's really really exciting.
Well, I'm laughing because you just popped my bubble of believing AI is nothing more than a processing. So, so I guess I've been, you know, pardon the pun, I've been schooled that truly AI is a career path. And I find that fascinating because we look at the different, shall I say, disciplines in technology, right? So it is a technology technologist. And so we have cyber. Like when we started at cyber, there was like a cyber person. It wasn't even a cyber, it was an information security person. And we had to do it all. And then we broke into, fractions of disciplines. And now you look at like some of the major tunnels of approach for technology, right? You've got cyber, you've got data, data scientists. Whoever thought data scientists would be a thing? And now, of course, here we are, AI. Whoever thought AI would be a thing and a career path? And so um I I now get it. So it does have some sprinkles, shall I say, of risk and
Yeah.
data, but it truly is its own path, correct?
And it's its own path, but it also does affect many existing disciplines. Like, let me give you a couple of kind of points. One is it's really interesting. Last night, I don't know if you saw, the Five Eyes issued a new advisory warning of the pace of AI cybersecurity incidents and the risk that is developing. So the way that they phrase that, and like I haven't seen that in a little while. That's quite a it's a very big warning shot when the heads of the Five Eyes say this. And what's interesting is they're not saying make sure your AI is secure. They're saying make sure your systems are secure against AI, because it is changing the risk dynamics for cybersecurity. And so this isn't just about set of disciplines around creating safe, secure, and lawful AI. It's also about what is AI doing to the other disciplines and how they're working. So I can't imagine, for example, that audit will look anything like it currently looks. I can't imagine that risk and even operations will quite look the same in a couple of years when we use AI to protect against AI. And so it is affecting other disciplines as well as building its own career path, its own set of disciplines.
So, James, where can our listeners go for more information about you, AI, Career Pro, and get access to your wonderful insights?
Yeah, look, just go to aicareer.pro. So there we have an assessment. We have some blogs. I provide a whole bunch of free courses and things like that people can get their head around. The one thing I recommend to most people is to do the assessment. So kind of interesting. We tried to put together a practitioner assessment and an organizational assessment, so you can look at where you stand as a practitioner, where your organization stands, and how they relate to each other and how you compare based on like geography or industry to others. So there's about 300 or 400 people who've gone through that in the last little while. And so it's really interesting data that we see from that around where people are, what their next step is, how they're progressing towards mastery. So generally recommend to people go to aicareer.pro and you can see the assessment there and can take that. I write on blogs all the time. Candy, I think you've probably seen some, and Kale,
Yep.
like I'm always writing. I seem to have gotten the writing bug in the last year and a half, and so I'm just actually working on publishing another article. So the blog has many articles.
Yeah. Good stuff. Absolutely amazing. So, James, thank you so much for joining us. We could talk all night long because it's just so exciting. And to our listeners, if you take away nothing else, don't let the talkers confuse you. That is absolutely the most profound thing ever on this whole episode. Stay at the street level, the operations, the tactical, and build your use policies and focus on the work. So, Cailin?
So if you guys can like, share, comment, share with your friends, any other networking people that you think need to hear this conversation.
Yes, I agree. And so again, James, hope to have you back sometime in the future and we can continue these fascinating conversations and I get educated along with our listeners. So until next time, stay safe, stay secure, stay refined.
And don't be afraid to get a little bit feral.